The topic that I'm going to talk about today is social competence in young children with autism spectrum disorders. I'm a professor at the University of Florida, and most of my work has been in the area of working with young children who demonstrate social and behavioral challenges. So I'm going to share with you some of the things today that my colleagues and I have been working on in our research, and we've used these techniques to help young children develop their social competence skills. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about social competence. I'm going to present an overview of what that is and a definition. Then we're going to talk about social competence assessment. We'll move on to social competence interventions. I'll do a brief review, and then there will be time for questions at the end of the webinar today. So I encourage everybody to write down questions as I'm going through my presentation, and I'll be happy to spend time answering them later today, as well as do follow-up emails and question answering throughout the week. So social competence is one of those concepts that's very hard to define. I think we would all agree that we know someone is socially competent when we meet them, and then we've also probably worked with or met people who are less socially competent or socially awkward. Many individuals with autism are socially awkward, and as we know, that's one of the key defining characteristics of an individual with autism. Yet it's also one of the hardest characteristics to define in an operational way, and it's also difficult to teach someone how to be socially competent because it's a skill that is not very linear like reading is. But is more complex and very dependent on the context that people are in. So when I think of very socially competent people, I usually think of politicians. To be elected into public office, one needs to be pretty socially competent. They need to be able to read their audience, they need to be able to speak to their audience, and they need to be able to communicate clearly. When I think of folks who might be less socially competent, they usually choose vocational jobs where they're not out in the public. So it might be somebody who works on computers. I think there's jokes that physicists may be a little less socially competent, people who work in labs or are not as in positions that are as highly visible as somebody as a politician. So to think about the definition of social competence, I want each of you to think about people you know who are socially competent, and then people who you know who might not be as socially competent or might be more socially awkward. Think about what makes them different in your mind. And we'll come back to the definition of social competence, but I think one of the things that is an important feature of social competence is friendships. And when I think about the importance of social competence in a skill that we teach people, it's really the importance of developing social relationships and friendships. I like this quote by Aristotle because I think it really speaks to all of us. And the quote is, "Would you choose to live even with all possessions without friends?" I think if each of us asked ourselves that question, we would probably never choose to live without friends. And the individuals I know with autism don't choose to live without friends either. I think their challenge is helping them acquire friendships and maintain friendships and understand what that means to develop friendships. So hopefully our talk today will help you figure out strategies to help meet the needs of the young children you're working with so that they can begin the social competence path and develop friendships. There are a set of definitions about what social competence is in the literature, and these are the ones that I think are most applicable for young children. And the first part of the definition is it's a child's ability to perform a set of contextually appropriate social behaviors and obtain desirable social outcomes. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the child has to know how to engage in appropriate social behaviors given a context, and that usually there are desirable outcomes. So if I'm greeting somebody, I'm usually initiating a social interaction with that person, and I may want to gain more information about that person. or I may just want to have a friendly gesture in the grocery store or someplace saying, hi, how are you, and move on. But there's usually a social outcome or a social goal. With young children, another aspect of social competence is their ability to successfully engage in social interactions and relationships with others. So when they're in their classroom, or when they're with peers on a playground, or when they're in their family home, can they successfully engage in interactions with others, and do they maintain those interactions? And the third part of defining social competence for young children is looking at whether they can initiate, maintain interactions, and interact appropriately with others, even if they're in a difficult situation. Again, most of us who have social competence skills can read a difficult situation and we won't engage in challenging behaviors, or we won't act out with externalizing behaviors. We'll be able to monitor our own behavior and know when we may have to leave the situation or know when to be quiet. So people with autism and youngsters with autism, particularly our preschoolers, usually have a difficult time with those aspects of social competence. But when you think about the definition of social competence, that's what we want to teach them to do, to have the skills to interact with others, know how to interact appropriately in different contexts, and engage in those skills even when it's a difficult situation for the child. This is a model of social competence that my colleague Janine Steester has worked on, and then she and I presented earlier this year, and I adapted for young children. And when you look at this, again, this speaks to the concept that social competence isn't really linear. It's very different than teaching other skills like reading or math, but it includes a number of other areas of development, and also it includes other people's perceptions of the individual. So when we look at social competence, we need to look at a person's adaptive behaviors. Can they function independently? Physical development can influence their social competence as well. People who are visually impaired sometimes have some social competence problems, or people who have hearing disabilities may have social competence problems, and people who look differently may have difficulties with social behaviors. It also includes language development, and it includes an ability for cognitive development or intellectual development. So adaptive behavior is one piece of developing social competence. If individuals have disabilities within adaptive behaviors, then they will have difficulties learning social competence. It also includes a number of social and behavioral skills. So we want to teach individuals interpersonal skills. We also want to teach them about self-regulatory behaviors and task-related behaviors. So if a person has difficulty in social interactions, or they have difficulty regulating their own behaviors, or they have difficulty adhering to the task, then they're also probably going to have some social and behavioral skills that are going to interfere with their development of social competence. Finally, another area of developing social competence is peer acceptance, or acceptance by others. Again, if I'm a person with autism and I'm persisting on a conversation that's not interesting to anybody else but myself, then my peers are going to look at me and say, I'm a little bored with her. Maybe I'll move on to the next person. And I think peer acceptance, being able to read peer acceptance or acceptance by others, is an important part of developing social competence. So you know when you messed up, and you can read those social cues and self-correct. So social competence begins with very young children. It actually begins at birth. Parents teach their children how to be socially competent, and usually social competence evolves with not a lot of direct instruction. But for individuals with autism, we really need to provide much more explicit and direct instruction to help them develop social competence. So to summarize a little bit about social competence strengths and deficits, if I want to look at an individual who has social competence strengths, I know that they can adhere to social conventions, so they may orient towards my face, they maintain appropriate social space, and they use social gestures. Those are all areas where individuals with autism have a difficult time. They also engage in reciprocity, give and take between the other person. When we're looking at social interactions, I talk and then we turn take. Somebody else talks and then we turn take back to the other person. When you think of that with very young children, it could be that you share toys back and forth, but there is turn taking and there's something called reciprocity, which is acknowledging and responding to another's initiations. And then there's the factor of appropriate responses to others' emotions and thoughts. Again, preschoolers may not always do that appropriately. They're young or young children, but it's something that we teach young children. If there's a young child on the playground and they fall and they start crying, most children will go up and pat them and show some comfort. That would be a typical response to something like that. And we have to teach children with autism about other people's emotions and perspective taking of others, because that does not come naturally. In fact, there's a organic or a physiological, biological difference in the individuals with autism, their brains, than typically developing children. So rather than that just evolving, we need to actually teach them those sorts of social competence skills. Social competence deficits, though, they often are portrayed by being very withdrawn in situations. So oftentimes an individual with autism would, if they have the opportunity to play in a group of children or play by themselves, they will often choose to play by themselves. They'll also engage in challenging behavior towards others. If a child is physically aggressive or verbally aggressive towards others, that's a sign that they're not as socially competent, because we all know to be socially competent you can't engage in those behaviors. Or they may be displaying very odd social conventions. Many children with autism are socially defined as odd and awkward. And so when you look at them, they may be doing things that just are very different than what other children their age are doing, or saying things that are different. Could be that they're really, they're very, very interested in something that's not interesting to children their age. So a little boy I frequently worked with was very interested in those little gecko lizards. He would chase them on the playground. He would spend a lot of time trying to get other children to look at the gecko lizards, and then he would talk for a long time about the evolution of these gecko lizards. Well, the other children were really interested in engaging in rough and tumble play, and they just didn't want to play with him because it was just not an area that they were interested in. And they often would say, "Oh, I really like Chaim, but he's kind of odd. And, you know, he likes to play with lizards and I like to play ball." So that might be something that interferes with what we would define as his social competence. So when we look at social competence outcomes, the benefits of having social competence is really increased opportunities for future growth and development. If I'm socially competent, I'm going to have much more opportunities to learn, and I'm going to have much more opportunities later in life for a career, and my life, the future of my life, is going to look better than if I'm less socially competent. People who have social competence deficits are not as successful in the workforce or in their adult life as people who have social competence strengths. I also will have increased development and maintenance of friendships, and as I said in the beginning, if we had a lot of possessions but we had no friends, what would the quality of our life be? And, you know, as my slide says, I will have an increased quality of life and I'll have increased positive social experiences. So social competence is an area of intervention that we want to work on with individuals with autism. It's a very important area, because the outcomes of being socially competent are much greater than if we have social deficits, which is usually isolation, very limited friendships, difficulty in social settings, and then decreased opportunities in our future and for learning. So social competence begins with successful social interactions, and that's usually where I begin with young children and preschool age children. We want to make sure that the children learn how to socially interact with each other, and in order to do that, social interactions that are successful are didactic. So that means they are between two people. When most of us are socially interacting, we're not socially interacting by ourselves. So we're interacting with another person. They're also reciprocal. I talked about that. They're give and take. And a very important part of successful social interaction is that they're reinforcing for both people at equitable rates. So I'm sure we all have people in our life when they call us on the phone, we look at our cell phone, we see who's calling, and we may or may not take the call because it might be draining to us to talk to them on the phone. I have an elderly mother who right now my social interactions with her are not as reinforcing as they used to be in the past, and they're not equitable because I'm in a caretaking role with her. So there's times when I choose not to talk with her because it would take a little bit more of my time and energy to get through the social interaction that I have with her. But if I'm going to develop a successful, positive, social reciprocal with some interaction with somebody, I want to make sure that it's reinforcing for me and it's reinforcing for the other people. And it's reinforcing at equitable rates. Otherwise, that social interaction is going to disappear, and I will choose not to interact with that person. So that's true with preschoolers too. You know, I've often seen on playgrounds, preschoolers will come up. In fact, I'm at our Child Development Center now on the University of Florida campus called Baby Gators, and we have a young child with autism in our future Gators classroom, and that young child is often by herself on the playground. The other children come up and ask her to play. She's kind of withdrawn. She can't talk as well as the other children, and if she doesn't respond, and it's not reinforcing to the other children, they stop asking her to play, and they choose other children who are engaging in the same activities. So to make her social interactions successful, we want to make sure that they're reciprocal and they're reinforcing for her, but they're reinforcing for the other children too at equitable rates. We also want to make sure that when we teach children to increase their social interactions, we want to make sure that we focus on the quantity of their interactions as well as the quality and the generalization across people and contexts. And I'm going to talk about how we do that, several strategies later on in the webinar about how to target those skills and how to make sure we not only deal with quantity, but quality and generalization. So we don't want to just increase a child's social initiations. We want to make sure that it's a quality initiation and interaction, and that once they're able to acquire those skills, they're able to generalize them across different people and settings, because that's how social competence really evolves, is that you're able to do that across settings and people. So when we look at social interactions, there are sort of 4 pivotal components of a social interaction, and all of these are very important. The first is an initiation. So a young child is in a small center in a preschool classroom, and they're playing with blocks, and another child comes up and says, "Can I share the blocks?" That's an initiation. A response occurs usually next when you look at social interactions. So the child who's playing with blocks will say, "Sure, here's some blocks, you can have these." So that's a response to the first child's initiation. A maintenance is that they're sharing the blocks, or they're building something together, or they're spending time engaged in a give and take exchange situation. And that at some point in time, there's a termination of a social interaction that's done in an appropriate way. So a child says, "Done, I'm moving on," or "Gosh, we have a great castle we just built, you know, let's let's put the blocks away, it's time to clean up. But there's some sort of termination that's done in an appropriate way. Again, to talk about a phone call, when you think about social interactions on the phone, they're very easy to know when it terminates because somebody on the phone typically will say, gotta go, and the other person will go, okay, talk to you later. Or, you don't just hang up in mid-sentence. You terminate the social interaction in a way that's appropriate. So when I work with young children who have limited social interaction skills, I usually actually begin with responses. That's easier than teaching them how to socially initiate. If a person's withdrawn, it's easier for them to respond to another individual's initiation than it is to initiate to the person. So those of you who are shy and listening to the webinar, think about how hard it is to go to that large party and initiate to somebody you don't know. But yet, if somebody at the large party comes to you and says, oh, I'm a friend of so-and-so, I hear you teach children with autism, it's much easier to respond to that initiation. And it's much easier to maintain a conversation when you have a topic that's of common interest to both parties. So I usually begin teaching children with autism to respond. And then I also try to lengthen the maintenance of the interaction through engaging interactions around common interests that children have, either common toys, common videos, some sort of tangible item that both children find reinforcing, particularly at the preschool level, because most of the social interactions that occur around young children are going to be around materials, not around verbalizations or conversations, although somewhat. Some children engage in extensive conversations. And then we'll teach about terminating interactions. I will also continue to work on initiations when I feel that the child has gotten some fluency in responses, because that way you may teach them to initiate over a tangible item such as a toy that they prefer, and start an interaction around that toy as well. I think, though, when we look at the social interactions, to go back to the figure, we want to increase the quantity of their responses. We want to increase the duration of the maintenance of their interactions, and we also want to increase the quantity of the initiations. But while we're doing that, we want to make sure that they're quality interactions, so that they're interactions that are reinforcing to both people who are part of the social exchange, and it's equitable. And so when we start targeting goals, we need to look at goals that can be social initiations, responses, and maintenance and termination that both address quantity and quality. Some social interaction skills that I think are important, and competence skills that are important to point out in the preschool age that I usually target are things like facial orientation. So I know when we all think about children with autism, we say eye contact, but it's really more facial orientation. For those of you who have been reading some of the most recent literature on eye contact with autism, one of the issues that I guess science has determined is that people with autism tend to not look at people's eyes, but rather look at their mouth. It's just the way their brain is wired. So that's why we often say children with autism have a difficult time with eye contact. Well, they're actually focusing in on different areas of the face rather than their eyes. So I try to visually get them to look somewhere up around here, not stare, because when we have social interactions, we don't stare at another individual, but we orient our face towards them. We may look away, we look back. That's a different skill than actually making eye contact. Joint attention is one of the earliest skills that has a foundation for social competence. That begins with mothers, fathers, and their babies, developing joint attention around objects, around each other. So it's some of your very early skills that you work on as a toddler. Responding to initiations, so repeating, expanding, or commenting. Later on, suggesting joint play activities. That's a way to engage in a social initiation, is say, I really want to play on the computer. Do you want to come and play with me? Maybe the computer is something that's a restricted or circumscribed interest of the individual with autism, and by suggesting a joint play activity or organizing play around a topic that's very important to the person with autism, that can help increase their initiations. Taking turns, so reciprocity, exchanging back and forth, maintaining joint attention or maintaining a social exchange, redirecting a social activity. So if things go awry in your social exchange, how do you get people back on topic? And that's a social competence skill that's an important one to teach as well. And then prompting requests. So if you're asking for something and you're not getting a response, you're asking for help or assistance, how do you keep prompting your requests to make sure that that person's listening and responding? Some of the outcomes, and I think that this is an important aspect of developing social competence that's often overlooked in the literature, is we all engage in social activities in order to gain an outcome. So if I want to have a social exchange with somebody, it's usually an outcome. It might be social pleasantries, but that's an outcome, is that we engage in social conventions, and then that actually, I find that reinforcing, because I'd rather do that than sit in silence. Oftentimes for young children, the outcomes are around play materials or tangible items. So they want something that other people have because they want to play with it. It can also be to obtain peer adult attention or gaining assistance, which is in a form of an attention. So maybe they do just want social attention. A lot of us like social attention. In fact, in one of my research grants, I did find out that social attention was a motivator for some of the children in our study who were engaging in social interactions. They also primarily engaged in social interactions around materials or tangible items as well. Sometimes we want to just share information. I'm sure many of you go home at the end of the day and your partner's there and you talk about the way your day was because you're sharing information. You don't necessarily want the person to comment on it or give you advice. You're just sharing the information because it's something to talk about. It could be you do want their attention as well, so there might be multiple functions to engage in social competence. Or sometimes we want to escape a situation or a play situation. That's true with many of the individuals with autism. They want to stop a social interaction. And it's perfectly appropriate to stop social interactions. We do this all the time. As I said, we do it on the phone. We do it when we're tired. We say, you know what, I'm really tired now. I don't want to talk anymore. Or we say, gosh, I've got a meeting. I've really got to go. So we have to also think about, there are people with autism who want to stop their social interactions. What's an appropriate way to teach them to do that? To terminate that social interaction and say, I'm done, you know, no more. Do you want to play? No. We all have choices about engaging in social interactions, and so do individuals with autism that we work with. It's very important to teach them that if you're all done playing, you need to figure out a socially appropriate way to say, I don't want to play anymore. I'm finished. And we need to teach the peers and others to respond to that. Sometimes in classrooms, I've worked with young children who have a teacher's assistant, and they're there a lot in the classroom with the individual with autism. Sometimes the person gets a little tired of having them around. And one child I worked with, the teacher's assistant was asking the child to quit playing with his shoelaces. He was engaging in a lot of stereotypic behaviors around his shoelaces. Well, the third or fourth time she asked him, he hauled off and hit her. And he communicated very clearly to the teacher's assistant early on that he wasn't going to listen and he didn't want her coming up to him and reminding him. She didn't listen because he did it in an appropriate way where he just said no or no. And at that time, he finally decided, well, I'm going to make her listen and I'm going to engage in an inappropriate behavior. Some of us have done this in our own social interactions. We might ask our children to clean up their room, they ignore us, then we go back and we say, did you hear me? They ignore us. Then finally we raise our voices and we give an ultimatum. You know, if you don't clean up your room, you're not going to be able to go out later tonight. So, you know, it's that exchange that we have to work on with the other person to get on a reciprocal exchange and teach the person to say, I won't clean up my room now, but I will clean it up before I go out tonight, or to just communicate back. So when we look at individuals with autism, I think, and we look at their social competence skills, it's very important to look at what are the outcomes. Is it that they're just going to engage in social competence and social interaction skills, or are they actually going to get something out of that? Usually they're going to get something out of that, and the important part of that is it'll motivate them to engage in more social interactions. So when I teach young children social competence, the first place I begin is assessment. And that's where we begin with all individuals with disabilities, is individualized educational plans, and we assess their skills. We say, what are their strengths, what are their needs, then we develop an individual educational plan so that we can teach them the skills that they need. So this is a brief webinar. We could do a whole other webinar on just assessment of social competence skills, but I'm going to briefly talk about some of the areas that I assess in social competence, and then I have a handout that you can refer to that gives you samples of some of the social assessments that I've used in order to do that. Well, the first place I begin is really looking at social contexts and assessing social requirements across those contexts, because our social situations become our social curriculum. So I look at the classroom context, the family context, and the community context, and I first ask, are there social opportunities, and when do those occur? Are they on the playground? Are they before school? Are they during center time? Is it at home during meal times? Do the children go out into community settings? Do kids play in the neighborhood? When are the social opportunities, and do they exist? And what are the social activities that occur during those opportunities? And do we have access to other socially competent peers? Those are really important, because we're not going to teach a child with to engage in social skills unless there's social opportunities, social activities, and access to others to socially interact with. It's important to look at the gender of the peers, the age, the skills. What are the peers doing? Whether they accept the individual with autism, and the number of peers. More peers is not necessarily better for children with autism, and we'll talk about that. You want to pick a couple, 2 or 3 peers. So I also then take a deeper look at that social context. What are the peers' interests, and what are the specific requirements and social conventions to be successful? What makes those peers successful in their social interactions? Do they share their toys? Do they terminate social interactions at the end? If they're engaging in challenging behavior, how is that dealt with? But when I go into preschool classrooms, I'll be able to point out pretty quickly the kids that are socially competent and the children that are not. And the children who are not socially competent are the ones that the teachers are reprimanding more and more. Then I assess the child's social skills, strengths, and needs in relation to those contexts. So all children have some social skills. What are the social strengths that they have? Do they have the cognitive and communication abilities to engage in social interactions? Do they have those adaptive behaviors that we talked about? And are they engaging in many challenging behaviors that are interfering with their social competence? So I take a look at the social contexts, I look at the social requirements within those contexts, and then I map on to those social context requirements the child's strengths and needs, and that is what helps me develop an individualized social competence curriculum for the child. So the discrepancies between the social context and the child's level of proficiency in those skills and requirements that are needed in order to become successful equals the individualized social competence curriculum. One thing that's important to point out is there isn't one social competence curriculum for all individuals with autism, just like there's not one social competence curriculum for all of us. Those social competence curricula are going to change as they age, as they acquire more and more abilities. They also are going to change across people and contexts. If I go to a large party, my social, or a Christmas party, or a whatever party that we're having, my social skills are going to change in that party situation than they are going to be at a professional conference, or they are going to be different in the library, or if I were to go to church, or if I were to go to an in-service training, or at my job versus going out to dinner with my friends. So there's going to be different ways that our social curriculum change. We want to look at the situations that the child's in and help them develop social competence within those familiar situations before we start taking them out to new situations. When I work with families, oftentimes I found that families will not take their children to the mall, or they might not take their child out to dinner because the child might be engaging in many challenging behaviors during that time. And that influences the child's social competence abilities. So I first want to make sure that they gain social competence in familiar situations with familiar people who can help them work on those skills before I help generalize them to other persons and contexts. So this is a way of looking at mapping the child's social competence skills into the requirements of the environment and helping to develop social skill goals. This is a little child that I'm working with in an inclusive setting, and the classroom context it's an inclusive early childhood preschool setting. Her parents have enrolled her in a child care center, and there's lots of activities throughout the day to promote peer-related social play, but the time that we're selecting is during open center time. Lots of centers in the classroom. The children go about. They choose which centers that they like to play in. There's a lot of familiar peers and there's same age peers. Our target child's name is Riley, and she's very socially withdrawn. I would say Riley has a little delay in language, but she speaks and she's got fairly good language, but she's definitely kind of awkward. She's socially awkward and withdrawn, and she's pretty passive in her responses to peer initiations. What she really likes to do is play at the sand table and pour the sand over and over and over. Now, there are other children that like the sand table too. And I've watched the children in that class engage in a lot of peer and reciprocal cooperative play activities, some at the sand table. They also share toys. So we have some pretty highly skilled social children in that classroom. So what we did in that classroom is we set up the materials within the sand table for shared cooperative play. And if Riley wants to play at the sand table, she's got to share the toys with the other children. She can't play there by herself and just pour the sand. That's not an option. So we have a lot of different materials within the sand table where she can pour them into containers or through sifts and things like that that the other children are holding. We identified a peer, a preferred peer, and for Riley this just happens to be a little boy in the classroom, but usually same gender peers we've found, or research have found, are promote more successful reciprocal interactions in the preschool age. We taught the little guy how to interact or how to play with Riley and read her social responses. So Riley is pretty passive, but that doesn't mean that she doesn't respond in some way. Sometimes she'll change her facial expressions, sometimes she'll smile, sometimes she'll look. And then we're also teaching Riley to respond to the child's initiations and share the play materials at the sand table. So when we looked at Riley in regard to the context of the play setting and the activities, and we looked at what the other children were doing in the classroom, we were able to map on social goals and modify the activities in order to help teach Riley how to socially interact during the target activity. So that's a way of looking at assessing different areas and then identifying different social goals in order to help facilitate develop a individual educational social competence plan. One thing that I think is important to point out is the difference between social skills and social competence. So social skills are the specific skills displayed by a child that the child displays, but they're really not as critical as the effect that these skills have for producing positive and reinforcing interactions for the recipient. So I may teach a child to do a greeting, but they can display this, and if it has no influence on the recipient, then it's probably not a generalized or socially competent skill. Another example of that, other than greeting, is that I may teach a child to show about different feelings. You know, if a person has a sad face, this is what you do. You give them a hug, or you say, "Oh, are you okay?" if a child's or another person's happy. So I may teach them how to read people's emotions. But if they're not able to read emotions and have an effect on the recipient of that, then it's really not a social competence kind of area. It's social skill that they learned, but they are not any more socially competent. So it's important to know that you need to teach social skills, but you also need to work on developing those skills so that children are able to display them in a very socially competent way. So social skills are isolated abilities and skills. They're necessary to develop social competence, but they're not sufficient. In order to develop social competence, we need to work not only on the acquisition of social skills, the fluency of them, and then the generalization and maintenance of them. Social competence, on the other hand, really includes a set of social skills, peer acceptance, and adaptive behavior. If you think back to the model that I had up there about social competence, those were the areas that were in our model. Fluent use of the social skills in the appropriate context, and independent judgment, drawing conclusions, and thinking about what is going on in those contexts so that somebody can respond appropriately if the context changes. So social competence is a hard thing to develop, but it does develop early on, and most children are very able to read social cues and adapt their behavior. Our job as teachers is to start teaching preschoolers to do that. Another piece to point out when we're looking at teaching and assessing social competence and is whether children have deficits in competence or in performance. So competence is that they don't know how to engage in social behaviors. We need to teach them a new skill. It's the acquisition of new skills. Whereas a performance deficit is really that they do know what to do, but they just choose not to display the skill. And in some ways, instruction for competence deficits are similar to instruction for performance deficits. We want to make sure that we arrange the environment to promote new skills as well as existing skills, so that we want to teach children new skills if we arrange the environment, but we also want to increase the likelihood that they'll perform the skills that they know. And then we want to, for teaching new skills, we may need to use more direct and repeated interventions and intensive interventions in order for the child to learn. When we have a performance deficit, we can actually encourage them to demonstrate that skill throughout the day because they know how to do it. We just want them to encourage using the skill throughout the day. For competence deficits, we want to make sure that we reinforce successive approximations or shorter skill displays, and then build them up to become more fluent, and then reinforce only accurate displays of the new skill. But for a performance deficit, we want to make sure that we're using naturally occurring reinforcement to strengthen the display or the skill. So children with autism will definitely have competence deficits. They won't know what social skills to demonstrate, but they'll also have performance deficits because they may know what to do, but they may choose not to do it. The little boy who was playing with his shoelaces, he knew how to say, no, I want to continue to play with my shoelaces. But by the third time that the teacher's assistant asked him to stop, he chose not to use that skill anymore because it wasn't working for him. So we want to make sure, just like with challenging behaviors, we arrange our antecedents or our environmental consequences to promote positive social exchanges, decrease problematic social exchanges, and promote and reinforce appropriate social exchanges. So think about the children that you're working with, whether they have competence or performance deficits or both, and think about when you're designing interventions how to approach that. So before we move into the intervention component of our talk, I want to talk about social competence instruction and designing an individualized intervention. The first thing that I do is I identify social context. I think we've already talked about that. The second thing that I do is identify and operationally define the target social skills needed for success. So if you go back to the example that we talked about with Riley, we know what she needed to do in order to be successful in that activity. She needed to exchange play materials with a peer and socially interact with a peer. That's what the other peers are doing. We want to assess her current level of ability in comparison to the social expectations and the peers and set our social goals. So that's how we teach all children with disabilities, or that's how we design instructional programs for all children with disabilities, is we do assessment and then we set goals based on their individual needs. The fifth step is designing a social skills instructional program. We want to implement that by teaching and reinforcing the appropriate social skills, reduce inappropriate social behaviors, repeat our assessment of the use of the child's social skills. So after we teach, we want to assess them, collect data on them, and say, wow, are they implementing what we taught them to do? If they are, that's great. That's initial acquisition. Then we want to work on fluency. And then once they're fluent, which that equals really more social, that moves towards social competence, we want to increase their social competence so that we program for generalization of skills for other settings and people. And of course, we always go back to step number 8, which is repeat the assessment of the child's use of social skills. That's our data collection aspect of teaching. So we want to not only identify targets, goals, but we want to design instruction, and then we want to assess to see whether they actually display the skills we taught them, and then work on fluency and generalization. Okay, I'm going to spend the next piece of the presentation talking about a hierarchical framework for teaching social competence that my colleague Bill Brown and Sam Odom and I worked on many years ago. We developed this hierarchical framework, and we've published it in different places, and you'll be able to see that in the references. And I've modified it a little bit, but it really starts off with looking at developing classroom-wide or family-wide or whatever setting that is, interventions that are going to promote social exchanges and social interactions for all children in the class. So similar to positive behavior support or response to intervention, it is a hierarchical model, and each step builds on the next step. And at the classroom-wide level of intervention, those things are appropriate for all children in the class. It just promotes peer-related social interactions and good practices in the classroom, such as developmentally appropriate or individually appropriate practices. Now, for children with autism, they usually need more supports than that classroom-wide level. So the next phase, depending upon, you'll see the intensity of the intervention increases a little bit based on the severity of the child's needs. The next phase is naturalistic interventions, and I'll talk about what those are. But those require a little bit more adult engagement in the intervention and a little more intensive instruction. And that can be successful for a number of children with autism, but oftentimes we may need to actually go to the third level, which is very direct and explicit skill instruction. So all of these practices actually fall under the umbrella of applied behavior analysis, environmental modification, which is our level 1, our classroom-wide interventions, are applied behavior analytic strategies. It's modifying the environment to promote or encourage certain behaviors. So those are your antecedent interventions. Our naturalistic interventions are milieu and embedded instruction and friendship activities. Those are also called, those also fall under the umbrella of applied behavior analysis strategies, but they are actually more embedded within the naturalistic environment. And explicit skill instruction is more congruent with the field that defines direct or discrete trial training. But sometimes children with autism will need explicit skill instruction before they're actually able to move back down to naturalistic interventions and classroom-wide interventions. So we may need to teach them social competence in a very intensive way, and then as they acquire skills and become fluent, we're able to back off and put more instruction into naturalistic settings or into classroom-wide interventions. So you can see the arrows on the figure go both ways, depending upon the intensity of the intervention needed and depending on the severity of the child's needs and skills. So social skills instruction, when we determine which intervention phase or level, we want to make sure we're looking at the child's developmental level, their chronological age, their strengths and their abilities, and their long-term goals. Remember, the social skills that we teach young children in early childhood will help them gain social skills for future competence in their vocational track, in their work environment. So our goal, long-term goal for all children, is that they become independent members of our society. When we start in early childhood, we're really providing the foundational skills needed to do that. Most of us who are listening to this webinar obtained great social competence mentoring or nurturing when we were young children. So that gave us the ability to then develop social competence as we went on through our schooling and into our adulthood. Let me talk briefly about classroom-wide interventions, and you have some of references for these in your handout. I was telling Terry that we really don't have the time today to go into detail into all our interventions. This is more an overview, but I think if you go to the references in your handout, you'll find more opportunities to look into the literature. This literature has been around for a long, long time, and there's a lot of research in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis that has demonstrated the effectiveness of classroom-wide interventions for promoting peer-related interactions. They set the stage for positive peer-related interactions. So in early childhood, we want to make sure that we have developmentally appropriate practices, which mean high-quality social toys. There are social toys identified in the literature, and play materials. So when you think of a computer, do you think it's social or not? Well, it actually can be both. It's how you use the computer, but it can also be very isolated. I mean, I interact with a computer all the time, and I usually don't use it in a social way. Those of you who are on Facebook are actually using your computers probably in a social way. You can share games on a computer, but toys typically that have multiple pieces that you need to have more than one person be there to work on are going to be more social than other toys. The housekeeping area of an early childhood classroom is typically more social than the book area. So it depends on the type of activity, but it also depends on how you create that activity to be a social activity. How you arrange a room can promote social interactions or not. Smaller space actually promotes social interactions than larger space because children have more of an opportunity to sort of bump into somebody. Not literally bump into them, but if I'm in proximity to somebody else, I'm more likely to engage in a social interaction with them than if I have to shout across the room and say, hey you, do you want to do this? So the way you arrange your classroom, the way you arrange your social materials have the likelihood of increasing social interactions. Also, inclusion with socially competent peers. We already talked about that. That's very important. With children with autism, they typically respond better to smaller groups, 2 or 3 peers, familiar peers, same gender peers, and peers that are socially competent. And when you think about it, we all do. You know, we usually engage in social interactions that are much longer with familiar people than non-familiar people. I don't think the gender piece always holds up as children age, or small group does not always hold up. But we also, at this level, want to make sure that we have effective interventions in place to increase the peers' acceptance and understanding of the child's characteristics. Young peers do not necessarily know about autism, so if a child doesn't respond, they're just going to say, oh, I guess he or she isn't interested. They may need to learn to read that child's cues just as the person with autism needs to learn to read other people's cues. Okay, the next level of intervention are naturalistic interventions. Again, these are interventions that fall under the umbrella of applied behavior analysis. They are considered systematic instruction. They're implemented during common, naturally occurring activities throughout the day, and they're child-focused and child-directed. So one of the things that differentiates naturalistic interventions from discrete or explicit interventions or direct instruction is that the child usually is interested in something and you take it as a teachable moment. Okay, so the child is looking at a group of children that are playing with a favorite toy, and the child may not know how to initiate, but the teacher may say, do you want to play with the other children? And the child looks at the teacher, and the teacher responds with, say play. And the child says, me play, or something like that. Or the teacher may prompt a peer to initiate to Riley and say, do you want to play in the sandbox with me? And you may teach Riley to respond by shaking her head yes, and the target or the peer by grabbing her hand gently and bringing her over to the sand table. So what's great about social interactions with young children is they're not all verbal. As we age, social interactions are much more verbal. But they can be just sharing toys. They can be motor gestural. They can be facial expressions. They can be, something that's totally nonverbal. So if you're working with children who are nonverbal, they can engage in social interactions with children who are verbal all the time. We just need to teach each other to read cues. And this happens too in our daily lives. If I'm interacting with somebody who's hearing impaired and they, I don't know sign language, I can still interact. Or, if I'm interacting with somebody from a foreign country and we don't speak the same language, I can still socially interact through gestures. So think about that as you're looking at social interactions. There's lots of ways or forms of social interactions. The adults embed themselves into the activities, and there's usually what we call natural consequences or reinforcers. So consequences are often reinforcers, but not always. It could be that Riley comes up and says, I want to play, and the child goes, no, not interested, and runs away. It's a natural consequence of social interactions, and Riley would need to know how to deal with those. I'm going to talk about 2 naturalistic interventions that are commonly used in early childhood with teaching social skills. The first one is called incidental teaching. Incidental teaching has been around in the literature for a long time. It's been demonstrated to improve children's communication skills. We also refer to it in with other terms such as activity-based interventions, embedded learning opportunities, but incidental teaching is what you commonly see it used in the literature around social skills. So we identify those functional social skills and social competence goals. It is child-directed, so we look for those teachable moments where the child is doing something or observing something and we want to encourage them or teach them a new skill. The teacher uses naturalistic prompts and expansions, so I modeled that for you just a minute ago when Riley is looking at the other children and she's observing them, and the teacher sees Riley observing the children, and she goes up and she says, "Do you want to play with the other children?" That's a prompt. And Riley looks at the teacher and shakes her head yes, and then the teacher says, "Say play," and that would be an extension of trying to teach Riley an additional skill in order to initiate an interaction. Riley says play, the other children move over, she sits down, and you know what? She gets to play with her favorite toy, and she engages in a long-term interaction. At the end of the day, the teacher says, "Okay, time to clean up," and she tells Riley that she's finished, and Riley picks up the toys and they move on. So Riley just engaged in initiating, the other children responded, they engaged in an interaction because they shared the toys, and then the interaction was terminated. And what you want to do with naturalistic interventions or incidental teaching is really look through multiple opportunities across activities and throughout the day to teach those initiation skills. If you just do that once a day, it's probably not enough opportunities. You want to really identify 8, 10 times during the day, and then take data on whether Riley's acquiring that skill or not. So that's one type of naturalistic intervention. Another type that's been demonstrated in the literature to promote social interactions among young children are called friendship activities. Friendship activities are a little bit different. They are embedded instruction. They are a naturalistic intervention, and I would consider them an ABA intervention strategies. They're a little bit different in that they are implemented at very specific times during the day, not when the child has directed an activity towards that time. The two research studies that I'm most familiar with who have used friendship activities have modified classroom songs or routines. So the one that I worked on was we looked at taking the song, The Farmer in the Dell, and most of you I'm sure know that song, and the whole class is involved, and we modify that so that one, the child with autism is chosen to be selected as one of the children where the farmer takes the wife or the wife takes the whatever, and then we modify it where they actually show physical contact to each other. So for preschoolers, this is acceptable because it's acceptable for preschoolers to hug each other. But if you're in a classroom where that's not acceptable, you clearly wouldn't use friendship activities. So the farmer and the wife hug each other. That physical contact increases the probability that children are going to have contact later on when they go out on the playground and play. So we've modified, and there's a couple of manuals and articles in your research, in your reference section that can help you design friendship activities, but we've modified these songs or routines so that the children have physical contact with each other, develop a relationship with each other, and then we look at generalization of social skills, social initiations, and interactions later on at a time when they have free play and they can socially interact together. And teachers, again, embed prompts as needed, and they have natural reinforcers or consequences. Now, think back to the figure I showed you. The third level is explicit skill instruction. And again, most of the children with autism or autism spectrum disorders will need to have some explicit skill instruction because they do not necessarily just learn social competence skills by social observation. They really sometimes need direct instruction. And there are three areas that you'll see in the literature. One, there are several social competence curricula. I've listed two here that are the most common, and there's references available for you in your handout. The LEAP model, which was developed by Phil Strain and his colleagues, is an inclusive, integrated social skills curriculum model for children with autism. And then there's the skill streaming model, which was not developed for children with autism, but there is an early childhood vision. And this would be useful for teaching some social skills. There's several other out there, but these are the two that I've seen most commonly used for children with autism. Then we have adult-mediated interventions and peer-mediated interventions. The adult-mediated interventions are much more adult-directed. The adult decides when the treatment or when the intervention is going to occur. They control the intervention. They prompt the child to engage in social initiations or social exchanges, and they provide reinforcement when the child engages in that. So they'll say, let's practice engaging in a social interaction, and they'll initiate, the child will respond, they'll respond back, and then they'll use a reinforcer. So oftentimes I will use things like restricted interests or stereotypic behavior to increase the probability and maintain the child's social interactions. I will illustrate to them or tell them that they need to engage in the social interaction before they're actually able to obtain the reinforcer. The adult can use verbal prompts, physical prompts, or gestural cues. So you want to verbally explain it to the child, or you may want to make up a social story, or you may want to use a video modeling kind of strategy, or you may want to make up a script. But you can use verbal, physical, or gestural cues. And there's different levels of cueing that you can use. So you may start off with a gestural, and you may then go to a verbal and then a physical guidance cue. We reinforce the social interaction behaviors, and as children acquire skills and become more fluent, we then fade our prompts and plan for generalization. With peer-mediated strategies, it's very similar to adult-mediated strategies, except we teach the peers to do the prompting and praising. And the reason we do that is because we as adults are more likely to accommodate social awkward behavior, but peers are less likely to do it at a young age. So the peers are more authentic teachers than we are as adults. And children acquire skills better with their peers, social interaction peers, because that's who we want them to be socially interacting with. So we teach, for peer-mediated interventions, we teach the peers to deliver the instructional prompts, and we also teach them to reinforce the children. One of my colleagues, who's now at Ohio State, has developed a peer prompting program, peer buddy and coaching model, which is a really nice intervention for children with autism. And so I've included that in the reference as well. But the adult monitors the social situation, prompts the peers to engage, and then the peers are taught to persist at social interactions, either sharing or assisting or talking to the children. And what happens is these two peers develop a relationship, and the adult really is a mediator and is not directly involved in the social interaction. One of the things we found in research a long, long time ago, back in the 80s, is that when adults are part of our social interactions or part of young children's social interactions, the peers tend to interact with the adult and not with each other. So I strongly encourage peer-mediated interactions over adult-mediated interactions. Peer-mediated interactions occur in natural contexts, so we want the peers, but it might be a context that's a little bit contrived. So I may do it in a separate room, bring the peers together. One of the children I worked with recently, we identified that child's preference of toys. We brought 2 or 3 peers into a separate room. We trained the peers. We set up a kind of pseudo play activity. We taught them all to play together, and then we looked at generalization into the classroom. So I'd choose 2 or 3 socially competent peers. I'd also choose familiar peers and same gender peers, and peers who are on a similar developmental level and are close within chronological age. And when I set up these peer groups, I do what's called plan, do, and review. So I say early on, it's really what we want to do today is we want everybody to play together. What are we going to play with? Then we plan our play activity. And then I assign different roles, and we talk about which peer is going to do what, and the peers decide what their roles are, and they become very explicit in their roles. We decide what the activity is, we plan it. Everybody goes and does the play group, and then we come back after the play group and we review, and everybody gets their reinforcer. So with the peers, a lot of times the reinforcer is just a high five or a little sticker or a smiley face. For the individual with autism, it's usually that they get to choose an item of their choice or a different activity of their choice. I mentioned Howard Goldstein's peer coaching and buddy model. I strongly, if you're interested in peer-mediated interventions, that's the model to look at. There's several research studies out there that have looked at and illustrated the effectiveness of this model with young children in classrooms. The peers are taught to approach the children with autism, gain their attention, organize a play activity, and then persist and reinforce. Before we close today, I just want to emphasize that it's very important to evaluate social skills and social competence instruction as you go along. And the best way of doing that is through direct observation and data collection. So just like all our instruction is with children with autism and other children with special needs, is data collection is a very important part of the instructional process. So when I observe and collect data on young children's social skills, I'm looking at whether they demonstrate the occurrence of the target behaviors in the context that I want them to. I'm also observing the quality. We've moved to Likert scales to look at the quality of their social interactions. So they're socially interacting, but are they on topic? Is it reinforcing for the peer? Is the peer bored? Am I bored? Is the target child bored? So I look at not only whether they're engaging in the target skills, so the occurrence or the duration, but what's the quality and what are the peers' responses when they do that? I also collect social validity and acceptance data. So over time, do the adults or the teachers or family members feel that they're becoming more socially competent in situations? So my direct observational data might not always capture social competence, but social acceptance data may capture that. But it is important to collect ongoing data on not only the mastery of the skills you're teaching, but whether they're fluent in those skills and whether they generalize those skills and maintain those skills across people and settings. So in summary, it's important when you're targeting young children's social competence that you design interventions that are going to help them be more successful in their social environment. So we want socially valid interventions. We want to prioritize social interaction skills. Start off with brief social interactions and then make them more complex. And then look at adding a new person in. And then look at changing the context. So we want to start off again from really becoming competent in one setting to expanding our social competence across different environments. We'll also want to educate the peers in the settings about children with autism, what their characteristics are, how they socially engage, what are the people with autism like, and if you want to interact with them, how do you do that? We want to make sure that we tailor the interventions to the individual learning style and needs of the child's level. These are individualized social skills training programs. There is no one-size-fits-all with social competence. We want to plan for acquisition, fluency, generalization, and maintenance. So if the child acquires the skill, we can't stop there. we need to make sure that they're really fluent in the skill, just like we do that in reading, and that they can generalize those skills across different social contexts, and that when we come back a month later or a month from now, they're able to maintain those skills as well. So in order to do that, we need to collect data on their social skills and social competence, and we need to help make our instructional decisions data-based. Okay, I think it's time for questions now. And I also have my contact information at the end here. If you have further questions or you want to contact me about the webinar, feel free. That's my email. I'm a professor in the College of Education at the University of Florida. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed doing this today, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you implement some of the practices I've talked about today, and I hope you'll find them useful. Thank you. Bye-bye.